If you run a business or you're just learning about how to run a business, you'll know from even a quick look at the world around you what investors usually want from a company. Growth. Growth in sales, growth in profits, growth in returns, growth in share price. It's all about growth. So, how should a business grow? What options do you have to keep those hungry shareholders happy? Welcome back to the Strategy Show, the show that connects real world business events with the strategy concepts that help us to understand them. It would be great if you could follow us and feel free to drop a comment or question on the episode. I'm Ben Dixon Green, and today we're going to tackle that key question that businesses are having to face. How should we go about trying to grow? Well, pretty much every growth choice you have available is either organic, where we just look to generate more sales through internal projects, or acquisition, where you go out and buy or merge with another business. In this episode, we're going to look at how each of those types of growths work, but we're also going to ask a fundamental question for a growing business. When does each of those approaches actually create value? And when does it quietly destroy it for our investors? Now, let's start with a reality check. Most companies don't sit in a strategy meeting debating textbook definitions of growth. They're asking practical questions like, how do we hit our growth targets next year? How do we respond to competitors scaling faster than us? And as we mentioned before, the pressure companies are facing to grow their performance is intense. Public companies are often expected to deliver mid to high single-digit growth annually, and in some sectors, significantly more than that. Now, organic growth often struggles to meet those expectations by itself, particularly in mature markets where there are fewer easily accessible customers for the company to sell to. Now, that's why acquisition-led growth has become so prevalent. Global mergers and acquisition activity often sits between kind of $3 and $5 trillion annually. So what we're talking about today, this isn't a niche topic. It's central to how modern businesses grow. So let's look at each approach in more detail. We'll start off with organic growth, because I think it's often undervalued in practice. Organic growth is fundamentally about building your organization's internal capability. Companies like Apple have shown us what this looks like at scale. Between 2010 and 2023, Apple grew its revenue from around $65 billion to over $380 billion a year. Now, yes, they've made acquisitions, but the core of that growth has come from product innovation with iPads, Apple TVs, software enhancements, improved cameras, ecosystem expansion, so locking customers into this kind of overarching iOS, and the pricing power that the company's developed based on their brand strength. That's organic growth working properly, generating more revenue from those kind of built-in internal projects. And here's the key insight. Organic growth builds capability. An acquisition just transfers it in from another company, and that distinction matters. Let's stick with Apple as an example. Apple didn't acquire its ability to develop a world-class operating system overnight. Over many years, Apple grew it organically. It brought in highly specialized software engineers. It invested heavily in internal R&D, and it refined its development processes. So the senior managers within Apple have often kind of grown alongside these capabilities. They've actually helped shape the structure of those software teams, the product philosophy, and kind of set the long-term technical roadmap. Because of that, they don't just use the capability that Apple has. They understand the operating system. They understand their software development teams at a really deep level. And that matters because it means decisions about how that software capability is deployed or evolved are made by senior managers with a really deep level of understanding. There's no kind of partial integration or inherited systems you bought in from someone else and you've had to try and bolt into your existing business. So while acquisitions can certainly provide access to capabilities quickly, organic growth tends to produce capability that is more deeply understood by leadership, more tightly integrated into your existing systems, and therefore more sustainable over the long term. And in strategic terms, that difference is critical because capability that you fully understand is capability you actually control and can develop effectively. There's also a financial angle that tends to be an advantage of organic growth. Organic growth typically avoids acquisition premiums and integration costs, which we'll come on to talk about a bit more later. These costs mean that returns for acquisitions are often very unpredictable, whereas for organic growth, returns are often more predictable, even if they're slower. But, and this is where strategy becomes real, organic growth has a ceiling. If your internal capabilities are insufficient, you can't simply grow beyond a certain point without getting some external help. Now, let's flip this. Let's have a look at acquisitions. Acquisition growth is basically about buying time. Instead of building capability within your business over 5 or 10 years, you acquire it immediately. Take Amazon acquiring Whole Foods in the US for nearly $14 billion. Overnight, Amazon gained a national physical retail footprint. It gained supplier relationships, and it gained a brand presence in premium groceries. Now, that's not just growth, that's strategic repositioning. Or consider Facebook acquiring Instagram for $1 billion. At the time, Instagram had around 30 million users. Today, it has over 2 billion monthly active users, and it generates tens of billions in ad revenue annually. That's acquisition-led growth at its absolute best. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Most acquisitions don't look anything like that. Depending on the study, 60 to 90% of acquisitions actually fail to create any shareholder value at all. Now, that's not a marginal issue, that's systemic. So, what goes wrong? First off, overpayment. In competitive deal environments, companies often pay a premium, sometimes 20 to 40% above market value when they're acquiring a new business, especially if they end up maybe in a bidding war with a rival. Now, that premium has to be justified through synergies, where we assume that the combined company, after we buy it, will run more cheaply than the two businesses currently do apart, through efficiencies, cheaper access to finance, and things like that. Now, that leads us to the second problem, which is overestimated synergies. Cost synergies between the two businesses, like reducing duplication, are usually achievable. Revenue synergies, like cross-selling, are much harder. Amazon, for example, may have bought Whole Foods thinking it would be able to sell huge amounts of a Whole Foods product at scale throughout the US on Amazon.com. But actually convincing its online customers to do that is highly uncertain. And while Amazon's made some inroads, it still only has a very modest share of the kind of complex, low-margin grocery market in the US. So revenue synergies are often assumed, but they're rarely realized at scale. The third issue with acquisitions is integration complexity. What do we mean by that? Well, basically, combining two companies' IT systems, supply chains, cultures, leadership teams in practice is far harder than it looks on a spreadsheet. The merger between AOL and Time Warner in the early 2000s, which was valued at around $165 billion, it is a classic example of this. You had AOL, who was a fast-growing internet company with millions of users, combining with Time Warner, which owned massive media assets, film studios, television networks, publishing, the whole ecosystem. The idea was simple. We combine content with distribution. So AOL would provide the digital platform and Time Warner would provide premium content. Now, in theory, this should have created this dominant digital media powerhouse. But here's where things started to break down. There were vast culture clashes between the two sets of managers. AOL was very high growth, aggressive, tech driven as a company. But Time Warner was a traditional hierarchical media organization. So their decision making styles were completely different to each other. AOL executives moved fast, they wanted to take risks, they prioritized rapid growth. But Time Warner executives were much more cautious. They were process driven and they focused on trying to control the project. What this meant in practice was that there was kind of constant friction between the two groups. Projects slowed down, decisions got stuck, and instead of the synergies that they'd hoped for, they got internal conflict. By 2002, the combined company reported a loss of nearly $99 billion, one of the largest annual losses ever recorded. Now, that's not just underperformance, that is value destruction on a massive scale. And what's important here is this: the failure wasn't just about the acquisition decision, it was the inability to integrate effectively afterwards. The final problem you get with acquisitions and mergers tends to be management bias. Managers may pursue acquisitions to increase the size of their company, mainly to enhance their personal reputation and to justify higher pay. So, they can show they've grown the company by 25% in the last year, but they've done it artificially by acquiring another business and inflating all the metrics that they get assessed on. And this can happen even when the deal doesn't maximize shareholder value, because that loss of shareholder value might not be apparent for some years after the acquisition. So acquisition does give you speed, but there are some serious drawbacks and risks to doing it. So now we've had a look at kind of the background principles between organic and acquisition growth. Here's the question that matters the most in both exams and boardrooms. How do you actually decide between building organically and buying another company and going down the acquisition growth route? Now, in practice, this isn't a theoretical choice. Most acquisition decisions end up being driven by three core pressures. First up, we have time pressure, the speed premium. If you're in a market that is moving quickly, acquisition often becomes less of a strategic preference and more of a competitive necessity. Think about it like this. If it takes you 5 years to build a meaningful presence organically, but a competitor can acquire and scale within 12 to 18 months, you're not competing on equal terms. And that time gap can be decisive. In fast-moving sectors, so technology, digital platforms, even consumer brands, first mover advantage often translates into customer lock-in, stronger brand awareness, and significant data gathering advantage in that market. Once a competitor establishes scale, catching up organically becomes much harder. So acquisition in a fast-moving context isn't just about growth, it's about buying time and market position. But of course, that speed comes at a price because you're going to be paying a premium for immediacy. And that premium only makes sense if the acquisition actually delivers the expected value. So that's our first area of consideration when we're deciding between organic and acquisition. The second area is capability. Now, this is where a lot of strategy discussions become very honest very quickly. If an organization just doesn't have the technical expertise, the infrastructure, or the market knowledge to build something internally, then organic growth may be theoretically possible, but practically unrealistic. If you don't know how to do something, learning how to do it can be very difficult to do well. And this is important because the "we could build it ourselves" is often a misleading assumption in boardrooms. Building internally can take years of hiring specialized talent, developing processes, learning regulatory environments, learning through failed attempts. Whereas an acquisition speeds that up dramatically. But, and this is the strategic nuance, you're not just buying capability, you're buying someone else's version of it, complete with their systems, their culture, and their inefficiencies, which is what we saw with AOL Time Warner. So the real question becomes, can you integrate this capability faster if we go out and buy it than we could realistically build it ourselves? Finally, the most misunderstood dimension that helps us choose between organic and acquisition growth is cost versus risk. Now, on paper, organic growth is usually cheaper. You avoid acquisition premiums, integration costs. It kind of feels financially cleaner. But it's also slower, as we mentioned, and that delay has an opportunity cost. Acquisition, by contrast, is faster, but it introduces financial and execution risk simultaneously. And here's where it becomes critical from a strategy perspective. If you overpay, meaning the acquisition premium is too high relative to the benefits that you're realistically going to get through synergies, then you can destroy shareholder value, even if the strategic logic of the acquisition is correct. And that's where many deals fail. Not because the idea of the acquisition was wrong, but because the price that you paid for that speed outweighed the value created by it. So cost is a huge issue when weighing up acquisition versus organic growth. But we also have a nasty habit of assuming that growing through organic growth is the low risk way forward. Poorly executed growth, whether it's organic or acquisition led, can destroy enormous value very quickly. A good example of this is Tesco and its attempted expansion into the US market through its Fresh and Easy venture. Now, on the surface, this looked like a classic organic growth strategy. Build a new retail format, enter a large and attractive US market, and then scale gradually. Tesco invested over £1 billion into developing and rolling out Fresh and Easy stores across the United States. Now, strategically, the logic seemed reasonable. The US grocery market is huge, and there was a perceived space in it for a convenience-focused format. But the execution reality was very different. Consumer behaviour in the US grocery market differed massively from the UK. Store layouts, product expectations, shopping habits, none of them were aligned with Tesco's assumptions. And rather than adapting quickly to local feedback, Tesco just attempted to plough through and scale a standardized model in all of its stores, which limited responsiveness in a highly competitive market. As a result, the stores didn't perform well, losses accumulated, and ultimately Tesco exited the US market and wrote off a significant portion of its investment. What's important here is the strategic lesson. This wasn't an acquisition problem, it was an organic growth failure. And that's one of the key insights here. We often assume organic growth is safe, acquisition growth is risky. But in reality, both of them carry substantial risk, just in different forms. Organic growth risk is often slower and harder to detect because it's spread out over a long period. Whereas acquisition risk tends to be kind of more visible up front, your price, your integration, your synergies. But it's concentrated around execution after the deal and how well you integrate the companies together. So you end up with a very uncomfortable reality in corporate strategy. You can make the right strategic move between acquisition or organic growth, but you can still destroy value through poor pricing or poor execution, regardless of which approach you've taken. Now, so far, we've made this look like a binary choice. You can do organic or you can do acquisition. In reality, the most successful companies don't actually choose one or the other. They combine both. Take Google under Alphabet Inc. Google grew its core business, the internet search market, organically. But it used acquisition selectively to accelerate growth in kind of nearby areas. So YouTube for video, Android, another acquisition for mobile ecosystems. YouTube alone by itself now generates over $30 billion a year. So what's the key point? Well, the acquisition worked because it fit the strategy, not because it was large, not because it was fast, but because it aligned with existing capabilities. Let's end with a critical reminder. One of the biggest misconceptions in strategy, especially in exams, but also in boardrooms, is the idea that growth is automatically positive. It isn't. Growth is only valuable when it creates sustainable returns above the cost of capital for the company. Everything else is just expansion for its own sake. And poorly executed growth, whether it's organic or whether it's acquisition led, can destroy enormous amounts of value very quickly. So the real strategic decision isn't necessarily whether growth is organic or acquisition led. It is, do we actually understand the market well enough, and can we execute our strategy well enough to justify the growth decision at all? Because growth in itself is neutral. It only becomes valuable when it's matched with capability, timing, and disciplined execution. Thanks for listening to The Strategy Show. If you've enjoyed this episode or found it useful, or hopefully both, make sure to follow so you don't miss the next one. And if you've got thoughts or questions, drop them in the comments. See you next time.